Thanks for listening to the Susie Larson Life podcast, available thanks to support from listeners like you.
It's only just a matter of, it's only just a matter of, sing, so the back row is you glide, 'cause walking just won't do dance, you don't have to know how to, ever since God's got you there.
Welcome to Susie Larson Live. Always so honored to get to spend this time with you. In fact, I look forward to bringing you conversations every single day that hopefully inspire you in your faith walk, that deepen your understanding of God's Word, and that heightens your awareness of His very real presence in your life. Well, in his 20s, Bob Lotich was overwhelmed by debt, stranded 1,000 miles from home, and had only $7 to his name. After crying out to God for wisdom, he discovered a biblically inspired formula that helped him reach a level of financial freedom he never dreamed possible. Through the simple methods within this formula, Bob paid off his house by age 31 and even reached a personal goal of giving away $1 million by age 40. Bob Lotich joined us last month, and today he's joined by his beautiful wife, Linda. And the title of his book, it's so good. My hubby read it on a flight out and a flight back on our last trip and loved it so much. The title is Simple Money, Rich Life, Achieve True Financial Freedom, and Design a Life of Eternal Impact. And last time Bob was on, we just were impressed that we need to do this every month. You know how we have Dr. Troy on every month to talk about health and the healing process? Because we want you healed and whole and healthy. Every step towards healing matters. Well, in the same way, we just thought, you know what? We need to focus on financial health. I think more people than not find that finances are a top stressor for them. And I love Bob and Linda's voice. I love their perspective. To me, it's realistic on one hand, and yet it's so faith-based on the other. So they're not asking you to give up every single thing you love. It's a doable process and plan, but then you add the supernatural component and you see God move in ways you've never imagined before. So I'm so thrilled to be welcoming them to our monthly lineup. Sometimes you'll get Bob, sometimes you'll get Linda, sometimes you'll get both. Today we have both. You'll hear from them in a moment. In fact, I welcome your questions. If you've got them, we'll do our best to weave those into the conversation. If you want a question, if you've got a question, text 877-933-2484. If you want in on the drawing for the book, it's just a great book. I really love it. You can text the word book to 877-933-2484, and you'll enter the drawing that way. Quick announcement before we get them on the show. Our theme this month is Love in Action. And we're well aware that many are lonely and hurting right now. And maybe you'd be someone who'd love to be on the receiving end of some love in action. Well, my colleague and friend and the host of our morning show, Carmen LaBerge, has recorded some audio clips that we can text to your phone. You'll get a few a week over the next several weeks. If you need some encouragement, you're feeling lonely, you text the word lonely to 877-933-2484. Now, let me tell you about my guests. We'll get him on the show. For the past 14 years, award-winning blogger, podcaster Bob Lotich has been a trusted voice for Christians wanting to find financial freedom the way God intended. He's shared timeless wisdom and practical strategies, listen to this, with more than 50 million listeners, students through his Seed Time blog, online courses, and Seed Time Money podcast. He's appeared in media outlets including USA Today, Times, Forbes, Yahoo, Finance Entrepreneur, and the Carrie Newhoff Leadership Podcast. He lives in Franklin, Tennessee with his wife, Linda, and their children. You can find him at seedtime.com. Linda Lotich is a co-founder of Seed Time and co-host of the Seed Time Money Podcast. She's a fireball who helps you see things from a spouse's perspective, keeps all the money talk light and fun. You got to have that. Bob and Linda, welcome to the show.
Susie, we're so excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So we start every day with the same question. Linda, I'll start with you. Just in your time with the Lord, what's God been talking to you about these days?
You know, I have really been learning more and more about resting and what that actually means. And I know I've heard you talk about it as well. And I feel like Bob and I are in a season of rest right now. And it's been really interesting to see it not the way the world has kind of told me that it should be, but actually what God says about it. And I'm just fascinated by this topic and also finding a whole new, different rest that I didn't know existed before.
Wow. I love that so much. Bob, how about you?
Yeah, Proverbs 4:23 is a verse I've just been soaking on a little bit. And so it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And the thing that stands out to me about this are the two superlatives and incredibly strong statements of above all else, do this thing is in guarding your heart, because everything, not some things, most things, but everything you do flows from it. And so So the nature of that verse and like how it ranks on the priority list has just been something I've been meditating and mulling over and trying to absorb into my life, you know?
Mm. That's just what I love about the Word of God, and how the Lord highlights what we need. I mean, Linda, you're pondering rest, and Bob, you're pondering a diligence of guarding our hearts. And it's like that, those are just small passages, but giant themes in Scripture. And that's what I love about how the Word breathes, because He knows what we need when we need it. So that's why I love this question. So thank you for answering. Okay, Linda, I'm going to start with you. And Bob, I asked you last time to give a synopsis of your story. And I want to revisit it for those who missed that past conversation. And as people get to know you in the months ahead, we'll just touch on it here and there. But for today, I really want people to hear your story. So, Linda, bring us back to those early years. I know Bob's his rock bottom moment, I believe, if I remember right, was before he met you, wasn't it?
Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So we kind of had our rock bottom moments separately, I think. The difference between me and Bob was that he moved forward a lot quicker than I did. But so it was honestly about the same period of time. I was maybe 20 years old or late, 19, 20, 21, somewhere in there. And I was working a full-time job, living in my parents' home with about two bills, which was a car and a cell phone. And I found myself in the position of having a debt collector call me because I was missing things. And I'm sure it was from a credit card that I had just missed the payments on. And I remember just the panic that I felt and the embarrassment that I felt when I had thought I had it under control, but my mom found out and she confronted me about it. And, my face got real hot and I'm just, standing there sweating, but trying to play it cool and just be like, it's fine, Mom, I have it under control, when I did not have it under control. But for me, the thing that defined it is that I was so embarrassed and so filled with shame that I didn't even know how to ask for help. So I'm having this moment, and even my mother, someone who could probably help me, I mean, she definitely knew more than I did, was saying, do you need help with this? And I couldn't even ask for help. And so that was kind of where I started, where it was like something not great already financially, but the shame and the embarrassment part of it, the baggage that was there, I think was a whole other thing that needed to be removed in order for me to move forward. So when Bob and I got married, I kind of had showed him some of my mess and we started working on things together. But I think it took a while for me to stop being embarrassed by the mistakes I had made, when really that's what's so good about the grace of God, is that he never makes us feel embarrassed. So when you start realizing that those thoughts aren't from God, that they're actually just created to tear us down and to keep us in bondage and in fear, then you can start seeing how God created it. And you view the whole thing completely differently. So now when I have mistakes that I make, because I still make them, I can laugh about them instead of being embarrassed.
I just love that you shared that, Linda, because lots of people listening today are dealing with shame and embarrassment around finances. There is something about it that feels so shaming. And I got to say, that is one thing I noticed in your book, weaving through your book. There's so much grace and kindness. I've read other finance books that sound they sound legalistic and harsh and rigid, to the point where it's like, I could never live up to that. And if I did, I'd be absolutely miserable. So I feel like you guys have this element going, like you'd said at one point in the book, Linda, if you like donuts or golf or both, we'll make room for that. But then don't spend money on stuff you don't care as much about. So it breathes for me. And so I so appreciate that. Bob, how about you? If you don't mind, just give us another synopsis of your story, just because it's unbelievable and amazing.
Yeah. So back, Linda's at her parents' house at that point. I'm down in Sarasota, Florida, and I had moved down there on kind of a little bit of sabbatical. And this one particular day, it was the day before my 21st birthday, when everything came to a head for me. And so I'm driving down this road. It's a beautiful day, sun's out, 75 degrees. It's like everything's going perfect as far as I'm concerned. And then as I'm driving, my car just dies in the middle of the road so fast I can't even pull it over to the side. And so I end up getting out of the car and like doing the thing where you grab the steering wheel and like pushing over to the side and all that. And as everyone's driving by, gawking and staring, and so I'm having a moment where it's like, all right, this isn't a great day, but it'll be okay. And then I start thinking about, wait a minute, everything that has to happen over the next few hours, because essentially I had just gotten my paycheck and I was trying to get to the bank to deposit it so that I could pay my rent that was due that day. And I realized, wait a minute, if I don't get my rent paid within 3 hours, then they're going to tack on a $50 late charge. And my paycheck is just enough to pay my rent. And I only have $7 in my checking account and my credit card is nearly maxed out. And like, how am I going to make all this work?
This is stressing me out.
Because now I have to, get this car.
And you already know the
towed
story.
somewhere.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm still stressed out over it.
Yeah. So like I had to get this car towed somewhere and then fixed, all under the available credit that I had left on my credit card was like $260, and then get to the bank and then get to the thing, like all in like 3 hours. And I remember as I'm sitting there and the weight of that in the car, like grabbing the steering wheel with like white knuckles and tears coming down my eyes as I realized, God, I thought I was doing okay, but I'm actually a financial mess and I've just been hiding it. And I've had this veil over everything and it's looked like it was okay, but it actually wasn't. And I remember like with those tears coming down my eyes, just asking him, like, I don't know what I don't know. And the fruit of my labor has led here. And this is not where I want to be. And so, God, if you have a better path, if you have a plan, like I want to hear it, and that's where everything started for me, is having that kind of breaking moment and really crying out to God for help.
And we referenced a John Wesley quote last time you were on, where you kind of got highlighted basic principles about earning all you can, saving all you can, giving all you can, and enjoying life. When you started to apply the principles that God really laid out for you, Bob, how soon before you started to feel just physically different? Because I know what Linda's saying, you feel it physiologically, like a visceral shame or fear or worry. When did you like physically start to feel different? And when did you start to notice a difference in their finances?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, as I think back on my financial journey, it happened, like I started feeling a lot better, like really quickly. So similar to someone who I think just eats a whole lot of junk food or has a really bad diet, like you can just start eating clean and within a day or two, like you're going to feel considerably better. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to lose whatever 50 pounds over 2 days. And the same way, like with us, we'd accumulate a lot of debt. But just by starting to take a couple steps forward, everything started to feel better, like it felt like more peace. It felt like, okay, we're heading in the right direction instead of being on a downward spiral. Like just, so short answer is things started to feel better pretty quickly, but it was a longer road to get to the point of like, being well above drowning. You know what I'm saying? Like it took a little bit to move there.
Wow. This question came in. Did he get his car fixed in time? Did he have to pay the extra in rent?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah. So it's funny. Every time I tell a story, everybody's like, you need to tell the end of the story.
What happens at the end?
And it's like, well, it doesn't really matter, but I will tell it. Yeah. Long story short, God came through like he does. And I managed to get that car towed. I had AAA or something. I was in a town. I didn't know anyone in this town, so I didn't have anyone to call. But I had AAA, which we had, and towed us over to this car place. And I remember I tried to open the hood for the mechanic, and he like slapped my hand out of the way. He's like, "Get out of my way, young whippersnapper! I know how to open the hood." And so anyway, but he ended up fixing it for like $250. So I was able to sneak that on the credit card, get there, get my paycheck, pay my rent. My friends came down the next day to celebrate my 21st birthday, and then my mom came down shortly after that. And I think she saw I was living on macaroni and cheese at that point, and it gave me a little grocery disbursement.
She said that he opened the door and said, "Can we get something to eat?"
That was her first clue.
Yeah.
Wow. And so in that time, in that season, when you kind of realized that it felt maybe like a house of cards, you started to apply yourself to principles. Okay, well, on the other side of the break, I want to talk about how you came together and how long it took you guys to integrate as a couple, different financial practices. And this question also came in. Please address how to consider net worth for tithing and retirement. I understand tithing on gains and income. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that one. We welcome your questions. You can text them 877-933-2484. Talking to Bob and Linda Lotich. Their book is titled Simple Money, Rich Life, Achieve True Financial Freedom, and Design a Life of Eternal Impact. What I love about this book, like I said, it's just so filled with grace. It's so doable, but there is the supernatural component that as you cooperate with God and then do what you can do and ask God to do what only He can do, He will do what only He can do. And I want financial freedom for you. I want you to get to a place where it's not the first thing you're thinking about in the morning and the last thing you think about at night, because God has gotten you to a place of freedom and health. Somebody got to give me an amen. We'll be back in a minute. This is Susie Larson, host of Susie Larson Live. You know, life can get so busy. And maybe for you, you're starting to feel the toll on your soul. Well, God can make a way in your life through every season, and He's always up to something new. How about you set apart some time to be set apart and discover what God wants you to know, what God wants you to do? Join us at the upcoming Set Apart Conference. It's for women on March 8th and 9th. You'll enjoy vibrant worship, workshops, fellowship, great speakers. Give your spirit the spa treatment. Register today at setapartconference.com. Hope you're having a really great day. Thanks for tuning in to Susie Larson Live, talking to Bob and Linda Lotich about finances. And I mentioned this at the open of the show, but we're going to get them on once a month, kind of like we do with Dr. Troy on the health and healing segments. Want to help you get to a place where you are financially free, financially healthy, where you feel not tied up in knots when you think about finances. And we welcome your questions. You can text those 877-933-2484. And also, we've got a few copies of their book. And my hubby read this book on one trip. He half of it on the flight out and half on the way back, and he loved it so much. You can text the word book to 877-933-2484. We're going to get to the question about tithing regarding retirement in a moment. But I'd love to know when you came together, because you guys are still, from what I understand, fairly young and kind of new on this financial journey. How did you integrate your mindsets, your convictions, and like what practices ended up working for you?
Yeah, I would say, I think, what do we have some tough conversations at the beginning, like, a lot of new married couples coming together, because I think we all grow up with like completely different mindsets around money. Like, even if you grew up in the same socioeconomic class, like you probably view money very, very differently because of how your parents did it, And so, like any other couple, like we came together and we had a lot of similarities. We had some key differences in how we thought about money, how we thought about debt, and all these different things. And so I think for us, it was just a lot of conversations and a slow, working through things one after another. I don't know. Would you add anything to
that? It took me a while to get interested in finances like that. I made that comment earlier about how Bob started moving forward faster than I did. And that was because he went in, saw the mess, and came up with a plan. I went in, saw the mess, and wanted to back up slowly out of the room, And so he did a great job of organizing really well and inviting me in. And I pretty much was like, that's fine. Just tell me what to do so I can. He came up with a plan, and I was okay going along with it until I started noticing that there was extra money laying around sometimes. And I started going, how can I get my hands on that? I started getting more interested because there were things that I wanted to do, like goals that I had for myself and for us as a couple. And I wanted to figure out how we could do that. And that was honestly what pulled me into it.
Yeah. And part of what I would say there is there was extra money in certain categories that you're like, I would love to spend that on something. I'm like, okay, well, then get in here. Let's have a conversation about the budget. Right. And that kind of forced you in so that we could have that thing so that you can see what's going on. It's like, all right, these are the actual numbers we're working with, and this is what's going, right?
Yep.
So, Bob, we touched on this last time, but for the sake of today's conversation, so some of the first steps you took, one was, I know you talked about this in the book, about cutting unnecessary spending. And you said you can do that with almost out feeling it because we have so many outgoing expenditures that we hardly even notice anymore. I would love for you to say more about that, but also what you decided to save and tithe, and just what other practices you implemented right away.
Yeah. So yeah, this is one of those things. Like we just live in an era where there's so much wasteful spending, and we don't even know it, and it's not even our fault. Like like we just a few months back went and looked at I don't know, but it might have been our Amazon subscriptions and our Apple subscriptions that we had from different apps or TV shows, and it's like I thought we canceled that, and and we got 3 or 4 different TV show apps that the kids were watching but stopped watching and that we're still paying for. And there's just so much of that stuff for so many of us that there's just a lot of money that is being wasted. And it's really simple to go through, that's just one of many different ways that we can do this. Identify some of those things that we're wasting money on, things that we don't even care about, and then reallocate that towards the things that are actually really important to us. So all that to say, that's kind of the first part of the question. The second, when we first came together, you had been tithing for what, since as a kid, right?
Yes, since I've been making money, right?
Yeah, I hadn't. I didn't really grow up in the church. I really started following Jesus at about age 18 or 19. Didn't have a great experience of giving set by one of the churches I was at for a little while. And so I had to kind of work through, like, what does giving look like as a Christian? Like, what should it look like? And then when you see bad examples of it, it kind of throws you for, a little bit of a curve.
Mhm.
And so I had to work through some of that. And I think Linda was helpful with me in that journey.
Sure. But even my experience was very much like you give 10%. And I think it can become so routine that we're not actively putting our faith in God. Does that make sense?
Yes,
It's like you just, it's like, well, I'm just doing this because this is just what I do, rather than why am
Yep.
I doing this, and being very purposeful and intentional about it.
So how did things change for you, Bob, once you found the right heart behind the tithe and you felt like this is an invitation from God? I'm going to put aside bad examples and consider that this is a call for me. What happened for you there?
Yeah, I mean, we just had, as I started moving down that path of getting more consistent with my giving, we just had stuff happen that just kind of proved to me this concept that you can't outgive God. And one specific example I remember early on is I remember I went and did the budget, and my paycheck had changed at some point, and I realized, oh shoot, we're not tithing. Because I thought we had been tithing, and it turns out we weren't, because I had gotten an increase at some point. And anyway, and we were like at 8% or something like that, and I forgot to adjust it. And then I did the math, and I realized, wait a minute, if we do 10%, we're not going to be able to pay the bills, like, because my paycheck isn't big enough, and we're going to be short like a few $100s to cover the bills each month. I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. I probably shouldn't do that. But like, we started praying about it. It's like, I don't know, God, are you real? Are you going to come through if we do this? And like having these honest conversations with the Lord. And we felt like, all right, let's do this. Let's just see if God is faithful to his word, if he comes through on this. And, Susie, I kid you not, the next day after we decided to do that, went into my work, and it was, a tough time in the company. And our boss had said, we're not doing raises this year. She calls me into her office and said, hey, Bob, we're not doing raises this year, but I'm going to give you a raise. And so she gives me a raise that covers more than that amount right there. So it's like, I walked out of the room, it was like 24 hours later. I'm like, this is just bonkers. And it was one of those things where it's like, God just gave me this, handed it on a silver platter, like, you can trust me, and it hasn't always worked out like that fast, but in that instance, that was something I needed. And yeah, I'll never forget that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a dream to someday collect these kinds of stories and make little audio clips and then just play them, as spot breaks on our network, just because I feel like I'm guessing a high percentage of Christians are so struggling. They have to be, because I think I don't know if the stats, correct me if I'm wrong, but they used to be at least 93% of Christians give nothing. And I've read about that, and they've said it's fear. Just more often than not, it's fear. Sometimes they literally do not have the money to put together, but most times Christians aren't involved financially because of fear. And I'm trying to imagine if we could start to sow some seeds of testimonies of God's faithfulness, what might happen. Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's beautiful. And because I think what's happening is I think there's so many people with stories like that. I mean, you know, with all your listeners right there, there's tons of people who are nodding their heads like, yep, I've had that happen. Yep, I've
Mhm.
had that happen. And so it is really common, but I don't think we hear it enough. And I think we
Right.
need to be hearing the truth of what God is doing, what he's actively doing. Yes, he did things in the Bible days, but man, he's doing miracles now too, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, so true. So true. So you cut your spending, you looked and took inventory of just subscriptions and things you've kind of forgotten about, but it's money out the door. You decided to trust God and you brought the tithe in. What else did you do to just say, we're going in a different direction with how we see finances and use steward our money?
Yeah. I mean, I would say, or do you have something?
Well, we drastically reduced our spending. I mean, that was that was my main problem going into it. I'm gonna be vulnerable here and tell you the actual numbers, but I was spending about 150% of my income every paycheck, which is why I was getting into crazy amounts of debt. And so when we got married, I knew that because we had felt like the Lord was calling us to be givers on a high level. We didn't know what that meant. We didn't have the full picture of that, but we knew that that was there. So there was this deep conviction of we have to get this under control. So when we came together and we saw that together, we decided to move forward. And it was easy in theory to make that decision of this is what we're going to do. The practice, of course, is very difficult, but we had such deep conviction that I said, okay, I'm going to go from spending 150% of my income to what do you think it was? About 5%?
Yeah, 10%. Like, it
Wow.
was way less.
And I mean, and I'm talking about just like personal discretionary spending money of like what I can spend on the things that I just think are
Yeah,
fun.
the rest was going to bills now that we had gotten
Right.
married and stuff like
Yes,
that.
and
Yeah.
groceries and all that stuff. And so that was one of those things that we just drastically reduced. Now, in my case, I had to do that. Like there was no way to move forward continuing to spend the way I was spending, especially because I was moving out of my parents' house and now I had actual bills that had to be, paid. But that was a huge thing. It's like, how can we cut back in the things and what do we actually need? And I had to ask myself a lot of questions. And a lot of it for me was identity related, where it was like, well, if I don't do this, am I still the same person?
Yeah.
And it was such a great practice being such a young person, being in my early 20s, kind of like wondering who I am, to start to find my identity in what God says about me rather than just running to different sources where I had maybe gotten my identity before.
Yeah.
That's so good. And I mean, the fact that you learned that at such a young age puts you miles and miles ahead of most people. And, we all have kind of, as you both touched on, an emotional relationship with money. Some are detached, some are fear-based, some are penny pitchers, some are spenders or whatever. But Linda, how would you define your relationship with money now? If you would have defined it back then, I don't know, a spender or maybe detached to what was going on, how would you what words would you use to describe your relationship with money now?
Yeah, well, I still am a spender and I make no apologies for it.
I am too.
And the
I am
reason,
too. And a giver.
yeah,
But anyway,
the reason is because I've learned that it's just something that needs to be submitted to the Lord. And once it is, then he can actually use it. So it is really easy for me to be generous, like really easy. And especially if the money is sitting there, I don't have a tendency to want to save that money. I can immediately I can see something and think of it as a gift for someone and be like, I'm going to buy that right now. Like it's very, very easy for me.
I'm the same exact way. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a saver, a natural saver. Their tendency is not directed towards that right off the bat, like it is for a spender. So we have to remember that just because we have these natural tendencies doesn't mean that either one is right or wrong, but we can use it the way that God wants us to use it, right? So I see money now as a tool to just be obedient to what God has for us. And that's really how I look at it is, I think there's an element of enjoying things, which is also part of my personality. And I believe that God put that in there. But there's an element of being able to enjoy things that I think is healthy as long as it is submitted to Jesus, you know?
So good.
And so really just using it as a tool, either way, a tool to pay the bills, a tool to um, help fund a missionary, or a tool to bless other people.
Yeah.
That's how I view it now.
Wow, that's amazing. That's so affirming too. And somebody wrote in and said, "This is such a good conversation, and it's so similar to food issues and relationships with food." So, as far as how we look at it, Bob, how about you? How would you describe what words would you have used to describe your relationship with money in those years in your 20s, and then now?
Yeah. Fear, I would have described it as fear-based, greedy, selfish, like all this, everything just revolved around me at that point. And that was all the benefit I saw of money was that. But similar to Linda, at this point, I just see it so much more as a tool for advancing the kingdom. And, and I see it through a stewardship lens, like this whole idea that, if we read the parable of the talents, we have this pretty clear picture of the delegated responsibility that we've been given by God. And there's lots of things, but like we are managers, like God is the owner of everything, and we are simply managing what he's entrusted to us. And so I view everything in our bank account, all of our investments, our cars, all of that stuff. I view it as God's stuff that I'm just temporarily managing to do whatever he would have for me to do today with it, and that has led to a feeling of freedom. And so I would say then versus now, I would say fear-based to now just feeling so much more free.
So good. All right. When we come back, we're going to talk about, are all savings accounts alike? We're going to talk about items that depreciate versus appreciate, and how to really take a look at that and inventory of that so that you can play the long game. We're going to answer that question about tithing in retirement. And if you have other questions, go on and text them in 877-933-2484. Talking to Bob and Linda Lotich. Their book is Simple Money, Rich Life. And I will say they write like they speak. It's just grace-filled, wise, winsome, and Linda's hilarious. So you're going to love that. You'll laugh. And it's good to laugh when you're reading about money because it can be stressful. More with Bob and Linda when we get back. Thanks so much for tuning into Susie Larson Live, having a really great conversation with Bob and Linda Lotich, and they've joined our monthly lineup, which I'm super excited about because they speak about money in a winsome, faith-filled way that makes it doable to achieve financial freedom and to become someone who stewards your finances in a way that moves the kingdom forward. Their book is titled Simple Money, Rich Life, Achieve True Financial Freedom, and Design a Life of Eternal Impact. And they write this: I found that the biggest breakthroughs when I remember that my job is to take natural steps, which usually gets me out of God's way, so he has room to do the supernatural. When we do our part, we see how big the mountain is, how impossible it is to scale without his help, which makes it clear who really deserves all the glory. And I'm going to read this listener question, then have either one of you speak to it if you'd like. Please address how to consider net worth for tithing in retirement. I understand tithing on gains and income.
Yeah. So my approach to this has very much been lean in the direction of giving more. Like it's just a simple approach that I've taken, back to what we were talking about before, this idea that you cannot outgive God. And so when I get questions about, well, should I tithe off of net or gross or whatever, I got a birthday gift, should I tithe off of that? It's like, my answer is just always like, man, God has been so abundantly generous to me that I just feel like it makes the most sense to lean in the direction of giving more because, we're not under an old covenant or anything. Like, I don't view this as a moral obligation personally. Like, I view it as this is the opportunity that we have as new covenant believers to give liberally. And I think a tithe is a great starting point. But like what you were addressing a little bit, Linda, before, like, I think there's too many Christians among tithers who have kind of reached that point and just, like, and I was one, like, reached that point where I said, I've been doing my part. I reached the finish line of Christian giving. And, and like we were talking about last time, Susie, like God called me out of that to go to a much higher level. because I hadn't reached the finish line. He had more for me. He had more that he was wanting me to do. And so, anyway,
Let's
short
talk.
answer is,
Oh, go
yeah.
ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, short answer to that is I like leaning in the direction of giving more. That's never failed me.
So good. We got to revisit that part of your story because that about knocked me over and I loved it so much. But once you started to apply these principles, you started to get some traction. You started to see your savings account go up. You were giving, and you suddenly wanted to pay your mortgage off in record time, which is a noble goal. You wanted to get debt free, and you went for a prayer walk in a field. And God surprised you, which that's what I always say. One of the ways you know God's speaking is that he surprises us. So he says something we wouldn't have come up with ourselves, but tell me what he said to you.
Yeah. So that day, as I was praying, and again, like you said, I'm going to God because we'd paid off all of our other debt. And I'm like, Lord, I want to get our mortgage paid off, and I want to get it paid off faster. And I had a plan that was going to take about 3 or 4 years. And most people are like, all right, well, that's great. Why are you complaining about that? But it's like, as an American, I just wanted to go faster type of thing. And so anyway, as I'm praying about that, I felt the Lord speak to me, not in an audible voice, but in a very much speak to my heart and say, if you really want to see me move on your finances, I want you to begin giving your age as a percentage of your income. And so at that point, I was 31 years old. So that meant going from about 11% giving to 31%. And so I scratched my head, looked up to the sky, and like, I'm talking out loud now. God, what are you talking about? This is crazy. Who does this? I'm like trying to figure all this whole thing out. And anyway, I went back and talked to Linda. And we both decided, if God's asking us to do this, there must be something really cool on the other side of it. But it was also like laying my goal of paying off the mortgage down on the altar, because the truth is that what that meant was that all the extra money we were putting towards our mortgage, we were now just going to give away. And so we could pretty much make the base mortgage payment, and that was it. And so I had to lay that down.
So you thought that was going to stretch it out for another 10 years. Is that right?
Yeah. So at that point, went back to the calculator, and it's going to be 10 years till we get our mortgage paid off. But it's like, but when you know that the Lord is speaking and leading, it makes it a little bit easier. And we did know that we know that that's what we were supposed to do. And it's not always that clear, but in this case, it felt really clear that this is what we were supposed to do, even though it was really scary, And so we began that month. We decided, all right, we're going to basically triple our giving up to 31%. And then it wasn't 10 years later, but it was 10 months later when we made the final payment on that mortgage, and that mortgage was paid in full.
Wow.
And so
how do you explain that?
Well, I don't, other than God, because it's one of those things where it's like anybody who knows us well knows that we are not smart enough to pull that off. Right? And so God is the one who has to get glory for it. And so it was just amazing what we watched unfold over those next 10 months, because our business income started increasing. Like, money was coming from random places that we weren't expecting. A huge tax refund came. Like, all these different things just started coming from everywhere. And then the culmination of all of that was that we found ourselves with enough money sitting there to make that final payment to pay off the mortgage. And we're like, wow. Look what God did.
Linda, take me to that time for you as a woman of faith. You guys are like-minded, going, no, we heard from God. We're going to do this. Talk me through the 10 months for you, what that was like, walking with God, watching him surprise you. What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it was awesome. I feel like just about, I don't know, not that long before that, I think Bob and I had really talked a lot about paying off the house and really gotten on the same page, which before that I was just a little bit less involved, I should say. And so we have really gotten on the same page of like, yeah, let's work towards this goal. And so when this comes up, it's this big surprise. But the thing about it is that God had shown up in the same type of way lots of times before this. And so like Bob gave the example of the first time when we were like, we're giving the wrong amount. Like that was the terminology we used. We're giving the wrong amount. And this is really, that echoes it, doesn't it? We're giving the wrong amount now because he's requiring something different of us. And so when we did that, saw the miracles come in, we were both just kind of like, we were very private about it, honestly, at first, because we couldn't believe it ourselves. We were trying to figure out like, how is this happening? What is going on?
Yeah.
And, we kept it to ourselves because we could tell that it was just really holy, Like we had been believing God for this and we were seeing it happen. And it took us a while to process it just because it was so unbelievable to us,
Yeah.
Wow. Just amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. And when we do our fundraisers a couple times a year, I'll tell some of our financial stories from brokenness to just trusting God and sowing generously. And I really believe this without sounding hyper spiritual, but I believe that you step into something so supernatural when you step into the dependence on God as your provider. Because to me, it seems finances are the last thing we trust God with, which is funny to me because it's like you can trust him with eternity, but you can't trust him with your finances. And I don't mean that in any shame or judgment, but just think about that for a minute. Like, what is your view of eternity if it's easy to fling your trust on the Savior for millions and millions of years, whatever that is to you, and yet you're terrified of trusting with your finances? I feel like it's just at least a question we're taking to the Lord going, I want a more ravishing view of eternity, and I want a more ravishing view of you as my provider because I want to live free.
Yeah.
Bob, any thoughts?
Well, I just think that's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree, though. And I actually just saw someone write that same thing just the other day. I was reading that, and it is such a striking thought, like to think about, because I remember like that moment where I decided to follow Jesus and that level of faith that, like, because at that point in my life, that meant giving up. What I felt like for me to follow Jesus, that means giving up all the fun in my life. That was the thing I was most afraid of. And I felt like I have to trust that God is not going to lead me to a life of complete misery and boredom and whatever else by being a boring Christian. And that was a huge step of faith for me. But like, and that was a part of this whole eternal equation, but anyway, I just think that's great.
Wow. We're going to pause here. When we come back, a few things we want to try to squeeze in before the end of the show is just savings. Are all savings accounts the same? And how do you decide how much to save? Depreciation versus appreciation, and a few others. And if you've got a question, now is the time to text it in, 877-933-2484. David writes in and says, this is awesome. It's so God-centered. Someone else said, this is so good. Wow, I love this. So thank you for tuning in today, talking to Bob and Linda Lotich about finances. We're getting them on every month and trusting the Lord to move all of us to a deeper place. I love what they said about so often when you do tithe, you check that box and you've crossed the finish line. But what if you got a bigger view of God and of what he might want to do in and through you? Because there is always so much more. And he wants us to engage with him in a way that requires some faith. We'll be back in just a moment. This is Susie Larson, host of Susie Larson Live. For 75 years, God has been changing lives through Faith Radio. To celebrate, you could win one of the 75 Faith Radio birthday boxes filled with Brant Hansen's new book, Life is Hard, God is Good, Let's Dance, and a new Faith Radio t-shirt and some other fun things to help you grow and commemorate this important birthday. You are an important part of the family, and on this special birthday, you get the presents. You can enter to win yours at myfaithradio.com. That's myfaithradio.com. Hope you're having a really great day. We sure are. Thanks for tuning in to Susie Larson Live, having a fun and great conversation with Bob and Linda Lotich. And it's pretty amazing when you can talk about finances and have a good time doing it. But that really is their heart and their approach to trust God. And it's not about reducing your lifestyle to absolute misery. It's about finding a path that God wants to lead you forward on, that where you can earn as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can, and enjoy what God has entrusted to you. That's the principle of this amazing book, Simple Money, Rich Life, Achieve True Financial Freedom, and Design a Life of Eternal Impact. And as they went from financial brokenness to really thriving and flourishing and gave away $1 million by age 40, which is amazing, they wrote this: simply put, we began thriving financially, and it wasn't contingent upon our income. Sometimes our income was up, sometimes it was down. Regardless of where life's roller coaster took us, we realized we could thrive. So a question about savings: how do you determine how much to save in these different seasons of life? And are all savings accounts the same, or is there a more effective way to use a savings account? Either one can answer that.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with how much to save. This is not a simple question to answer because obviously it's very, very different in different seasons. But I will tell you something really interesting. I was just reading an article the other day where this guy studied 225 different millionaires and studied their habits to see what had helped them become a millionaire. And he classified them into different categories. But basically, the ones that had invested and saved their way to wealth rather than, running a startup or something like that, the ones that had saved and invested to become millionaires, he said they saved an average of 20% of their income, which I thought saved and then invested that percentage. And I thought that was really interesting because if you go back to the book of Genesis and you look at what God told Joseph through the dream of what to do in Egypt when there was the famine and everything, he said, I want you to save 1/5 of all the produce during the good years so that you have that for the famine that's coming up, which is 20%. So I just found that to be really fascinating. Now, 20% is a whole lot. A lot of people are like, I can't do that. It's too big of a jump. And that's fine. But I think it's a great thing to shoot for, because I think if you can get to that point and you can do that for a couple of decades and you can invest safely and wisely with that amount, like you're going to be in a position in your later years to be able to write checks with lots of zeros on them, for lots of different ministries you want to support.
I remember you said something last time. You quoted an Andy Stanley insight because I asked, what are you guys' metrics, or how do you decide who to give to, what to sow into? And he had two standards. Help me remember what they were.
Yeah, he said, give from a grateful heart and give from a broken heart. And so the gratefulness component is, what are the things that you're thankful for that they exist? And how can you use your dollars to keep them in existence? And then what are the things in the world that break your heart, or the personal situations around you that break your heart? And how can you use your money to help alleviate those things? I've just loved that framework.
So good. And Linda, how has generous living and generous giving changed how you walk with God and even how you walk with others?
Yeah. The way it's changed that I walk with God is that I'm always looking to be used by him instead of being on the defensive of, well, what am I going to get? Does that make sense? Like, how is this going to take care of me? As I'm seeing it much more abundantly, like there's not just one opportunity to have this thing that maybe I've been desiring for a long time. There's not just one opportunity to I don't know, like maybe take a trip that I've been wanting to do for a long time. It's like I can choose to just follow God and the things that he has for me. And when I seek him and seek his kingdom, he's going to take care of me, right? Yeah. Like that's what he promises in his word. So just seeing things as when I'm seeking him first, not worrying about myself as much. And I think, honestly, being generous, it's the best way to live and the easiest way to get rid of discontentment and to get rid of misery is when you're thinking about others. Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, 100%. Oh, you're asking your husband. Sorry.
No,
what do you think, Bob? Would you agree with your wife?
Both of you.
How about savings accounts?
Is
there one size fits all, or tell me what you think about savings accounts?
Yeah, no, it's not one size fits all at all. This is a funny thing. Like I nerd out about this stuff a little bit. And there are a lot of big banks where you'll go look at your savings rate. And anybody listen, you can go do this. If you're at some of the big banks, I'm not going to name names to tear anybody down, but a lot of them, you'll go look at your savings account, and it's paying like 0.1% interest rate right now. And when there are plenty of banks that are paying over 4% on a savings account at the current moment. And so, which if you have a decent amount of savings, that yields a whole lot of money over the course of a year. So they're not all the same. But so if you are wanting to actually get some money out of your savings, look for some of these other banks. There are a lot that are paying much better interest rates at this point. And given what happened, I don't know, maybe a year or so ago, you want to make sure that it's FDIC insured. Make sure that your savings account, the bank that you're with, has that federal deposit insurance to keep that money safe.
So we get ready to wrap here. Linda, what do you know about God now that you didn't know even as well 5-10 years ago?
For sure, I developed a level of intimacy with the Lord that just kind of blew my mind. And I remember it was when I was going through a really difficult time. It was after I gave birth to my son, and the healing process was really difficult for me. And in my desperation, I wasn't sleeping. That was part of it, is I wasn't able to sleep. So I was probably getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep every 24-hour period, and they were happening in broken up segments. And as this was happening, there was really nowhere for me to go except to the Lord. And in that desperation, I found a new level of my relationship with God that I had never seen before. And so much to the point that when I think back on it, it makes me jealous for that time. And even though it was one of the most challenging physically times that I've ever had in my entire life, the time with the Lord was so rich and so good that I almost look forward to walking through difficult situations again, because I know the desperation that comes with that and that level of intimacy. But even just the other day, I was praying
I'm
about
so sorry. We're out of time, but oh my goodness, I love you guys, and I can't wait to talk to you next month. And I love you. We'll meet you back here next time.
Thanks for listening to Susie Larson Live. Podcasts like mine are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes and give now.